Good afternoon, everyone, and I'm delighted to welcome Rose Tremain, furthest away from me, and Alex Clark to Small Wonder. Alex Clark is the chair of this afternoon's session. Rose Tremain, who is the focus of the session, she encapsulates she encapsulates the holy grail of being a popular literary author. So we're particularly glad to have her here at Charleston, where we have such a strong literary tradition. Rose's award-winning books include The Road Home, which won the Orange Prize, Music and Silence, Sacred Country, Restoration, and Maryville. She's recently been appointed, in her spare time, obviously, Chancellor of the University of East Anglia. And we're delighted today to host the first reading from her new collection of short stories. It's a selection plus some new stories at Small Wonder, The American Lover. So you're going to be in for a treat. So the format of today is that Rose will have a conversation with Alex. She'll then read a story, and there'll be the opportunity of questions from the audience. So I'm delighted to hand over to Alex and to Rose Tremain.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Diana, and how lovely and gratifying it is to see such a full audience here today. It's so great that you've all come in from the beautiful sunshiny weather to listen to us talking about Rose's new collection. It's wonderful to be able to be here to celebrate Rose's work and also to celebrate the short story itself. And I think we're going to get some really interesting insights into the nature of writing short fiction and its importance. Rose is well known, of course, to all of us as both a novelist and a short story writer. And this year she is one of the shortlisted writers for the BBC National Short Story Award, which has a terrific, and this is a sort of an aside, entirely female shortlist. And that is announced, isn't it, this week, Rose? We're going to talk for a little while, and then Rose is going to read one of her stories from the new collection. And then you're going to be able to ask questions, so do get your thinking caps on. But in the meantime, welcome, Rose, and thank you. Thank you for joining us. Just tell us a little bit about this collection, and maybe in particular its title story, which is the story shortlisted for the BBC Award.
The title short story came last. Short stories are short story collections, and well, we'll go on to talk about how they get written, but short story collections are obviously assembled in a very different way from how you put together a novel. And actually this collection I've been gradually putting together over, I think, at least 5 years. I think it's about 5 years since I published the last one. And of course, when you're writing the first sort of little bite of the next collection, you have no concept that it could be part of a collection. You think probably, well, that's me done for short stories. Because I think, talking to poets, I think the germ of an idea for a short story is rather an elusive thing. I personally find that they only come to me every now and then. I'm not writing them all the time, so I'm rather slow to assemble the collection. And the title story came to me when I was in France. As my fiction probably demonstrates, I had part of my education in France, and I spent quite a lot of time there. And I wanted to write, I mean, there's a tiny little facet in this story which connects into my own life. And I'm sure people who know my work realize that I don't very often, if ever, really include my own biography in the fiction. But there is a little bit of me in this story. But I wanted to write a kind of a powerful, probably quite sort of difficult story about that thing which I've been haunted by for a long time, that our lives in the end turn on very few important moments. And I think we can all look back and say, that was the moment where my life changed in a certain direction, sometimes for wonderful reasons and sometimes for terrible reasons. And I wanted to get this sort of pivotal moment where sort of a sort of metaphorical shot is fired at this young woman, and she falls in love with this man who is going to be very cruel to her, and she is then going to undergo, in order to try and recover from his abandonment of her, the transition to trying to write about the love affair in fiction, and then the fame and the riches and so on that the fiction brings wounds her afresh. So it's like a series of kind of like Russian dolls. From this one moment, all these things go on and on and on, and seemingly sort of almost never-endingly.
What I thought was also fantastically interesting about it was that it announces itself to be one kind of book, one kind of story. One thinks the story that we sort of all recognise, the story of a woman kind of done wrong, a young woman done wrong by a more sophisticated lover, and then she becomes an entirely different character, and it seems almost to have a sort of fable-like quality, and yet also is studied with these references to particular time and place. It's very particular as well.
It's very particular. It's very particular to my own life. Set in the love affair occurs in the 60s, and it's recapitulated in the 1970s, which is when she's remembering it. And she says at one point that she is two different selves, that there was the self before she meets Thaddeus, the lover, and the self afterwards, when she's been abandoned and when she decides to write about it. I never thought of it exactly as a fable, but there are these two distinct selves. And it was very important, in order to coax these two selves out of the story in a way that would be sort of instantly believable to the reader, because you haven't got much time in a short story. I mean, it's another thing we need to talk about, perhaps, the question of time in stories, even in quite a long story like this. That there needed to be a sort of interrogator in this story. And so it occurred to me that there was this person who comes to, the Portuguese woman who comes to clean the flat where Beth can't move because her legs are broken. And the story is related, the latter part of the story is related in a series of conversations to Rosalita, who is the sort of, not only the listener, but the conscience of the story. Rosalita keeps saying to her, well, what you did is a bit dumb, wasn't it? And you're not so clever, and, like almost you brought this on yourself. And I don't know, readers' reactions have been different, but some readers think, well, actually this girl, she wasn't wise enough at that young age of 19 to understand what was happening. She did some very foolish things. So in a sense, what's happened to her is deserved. And of course others have other reactions and thinks that she's been very victimized. So, I mean, also, it really interests me that at the time that I was that age, in the 1960s, I mean, I think young women were much more sort of tuned to the idea that our futures lay with the men that we were with or married or so on. I sort of managed to escape the future mapped out for me by getting to university and then taking a different pathway. But here's a girl who is sort of trapped in that environment of that she will have. In fact, she has a job that I once had in the gift wrap department in Harrods. This was my first ever job. People say to me, what was your first job? And they probably expect me to say, oh, well, I worked in publishing or whatever. But I didn't. I worked in the gift wrap department in Harrods, from which I was sacked, actually, very conveniently, about 10 days before Christmas.
Why? Why? We have to ask why. What did you do?
Oh, well, I was smoking in those days. Peter Stuyvesant cigarettes. I was smoking in the stockroom. Terrible. I could have set the whole of Harrods on
Just
fire.
before Christmas?
Just before Christmas, yes. So my sacking was quite deserved. Anyway, there she is. She's got the same job, and her life is a bit dead-ended at 19, which is how I felt mine to be. And then this person takes her out of it, but takes her in a direction which is going to wound her.
Let's talk about what you mentioned then. Let's talk about the issue of time in short stories. This collection does lots and lots of different things with time, doesn't it? There are stories told over a long period of time, as this one. There are individual moments. One of the stories takes place essentially during a bus journey. Yeah. You know, there is a very complicated story that's structured. I'm thinking of Lucy and Gaston. It's a story that's structured in different time schemes, in different places, and with different protagonists. So in this collection, and I think in your others too, you seem to have thought, right, I'm going to take time on. This is going to be one of the things I'm going to think about.
I think that's right. Although, again, I mean, it's maybe just sort of turned out like that because, as I say, these stories were assembled over a long period of you know, different kinds of work. And then it is, when I look at it, I mean, the thing I feel pleased about with it is the diversity of the stories. I think there's possibly two ways of presenting a story collection. Perhaps there are more than two, and I haven't thought of the third, but I think there are probably two, which is that you present them in a sort of thematic way, that they're all thematically joined, and they're versions of the same trope, but done differently. Or in this case, they're all completely different. Although somebody said to me the other day, actually, I think there is something binding them, which is not just time and the way, you know, time, that moment in time which sort of redefines a life, which occurs in the title story, but also this idea that, I can't remember what I was going to say about that now. Sorry, I've slightly lost the thread there.
That time sort of binds people in different ways in these stories, I suppose, doesn't it?
Yes, it binds people in different ways, and this whole sort of question of diversity. What I hope for it is that it makes people think of all the different kinds of writer that I might be. I mean, my career has been, I think, a maddening one to publishers because I haven't written the same book over and over again. I've written different ones. I have revisited subjects, but mainly the books have been very, very different, one from the next. And I've come to historical novels and gone away from them and come back to them and so on. But I sort of feel what this collection might ideally do is to sort of do a little showcase of all the things that I'm comfortable doing. And I'm sure readers will find their own preferences and that I'm more comfortable in one mode than another. I mean, there's one story about the fictional Mrs. Danvers in Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, where I've been very playful with kind of intertextual things, which is not normally something I visit at all. But I suddenly got this inspiration for this story. And it's interesting to reflect on the ratio of research and reading that goes into the writing of something like that and the tininess of the story. In order to write the story about Mrs. Danvers, I felt I not only had to read Rebecca again and a couple of other of Daphne du Maurier's books, but I also read 2 biographies of Daphne du Maurier's life. I mean, hours and hours of reading to write a story that's 10 pages. But I think unless one does that, the stories sort of feel thin.
The effect, though, in that particular story, and not to sort of give anything away about it, is that as a reader, you actually don't know what's true and what's not in it. I mean, I read that story. It's a story essentially about the real Mrs. Danvers. It's you know, the inspiration behind that character, and Daphne du Maurier makes an appearance in it. And I ended that story and thought that might be absolutely accurate. I may have read a really accurate description of how that inspiration came, or you may have totally invented, and I have no idea at the end of the story.
Well, that's rather gratifying, actually, because you don't. You can then. I mean, this is what I long to liberate readers to do, to make up their own mind about, you know, how they want to feel it, how they want to experience it. I think. I mean, the most truthful answer to that is that there are little facets of Daphne du Maurier's life that I've drawn on, because I didn't want to, you know, write things which were completely historically inaccurate about her. I mean, I very seldom write about real characters, but she's very real. And there are facets of her life which I think pertain very particularly to this story. And the rest is just a seething mass of invention and craziness, really.
There is this, and with your caveat in mind that these are stories assembled over a long period of time rather than shaped absolutely deliberately. But there is another very, very famous writer in this collection, and that's Tolstoy, in a wonderfully playful story called The Jester of Astapova, which is essentially about Tolstoy's final days and hours, but putting someone else center stage.
Yes, I think this is I mean, when I'm working with history, this is my favourite mode. I did it in Restoration again, in the sequel to Restoration, Merivale, which is to have an invented character, who in this case is the station master. Probably many of you will know the end of Tolstoy's life, that he had this terrible, terrible quarrel with his wife, and aged 84, I think he was, in 1910, he leaves his estate in the middle of the night with his daughter and his doctor, and he gets on a train and he's going to visit his sister. He thinks he's going to take refuge with his sister, but he's taken very ill on the train. He's got pneumonia, and the train arrives at this little station. All of this is real. The train arrives at this little station called Astapovo, which is in the middle of nowhere. It's somewhere between Dansk and Smolensk. And this, in fact, is where Tolstoy dies, in this railway station. And when I heard that story told some years ago, I thought, there is something very good to be done with that, but I can't just tell that as a story, because that's history. And then I thought, whose lives would have been changed by this extraordinary arrival and then departure, one swiftly following the other? I thought of the person who would be most changed would be the station master. And then I thought, well, okay, so the station master isn't just a sort of cipher for what happens to Tolstoy. The station master has to have his own story, his own journey through this piece. And the two kind of are interwoven and connected and cross over and intersect and alter each other. But again, the research I did for that was absolutely huge, because I needed to get the time scale right, the time scale of Tolstoy's dying, which is over several days. And I was looking at Russian train timetables. I mean, it's just crazy. It's out of all proportion to what you get. I want you to remember this if you read these stories, all the work that lies behind them.
But also, in terms of you, again, something that you kind of alluded to, the idea of the stories as a showcase or as a way of showing different kinds of writing. A story like that, and throughout this collection, is incredibly funny. It's also very sad. It has the dying Tolstoy in it and his terribly painful aspects of his life. But it's also very funny. The story that you're going to read, for example, alludes to your interest in New Zealand, which you've written about in novel length. There are all sorts of different places, different voices. Is it just, again, with the caveat that you didn't write them all in one go, is it just tremendous fun? Is there a sense of play when you sit down to write a short story?
I think it's delirious fun. And on the other side of the deliriousness is the feeling that I'm going to fall off the cliff. I think it's quite important to say that the short story form is, well, the word I've used before, and I think I can't quite think of a better one, is perilous. It's a very perilous form. So my analogy of the cliff is not so stupid, because it has to conform to its own shortness, and yet, like a really good poem, it has to strive to say something that the readers can really take away and keep, and ideally feel that they've taken away something bigger than what's in the story, which is, of course, what they themselves are managing to bring to it. So once embarked, it's both fascinating and extremely difficult. And when I used to teach at the University of East Anglia, I used to say to my students, who of course all began with short stories, don't imagine just because a story is short, this is an easy form. I mean, a novel, I think, the idea for a novel can be quite small and fragile, but because of the accumulation of ideas that come gradually and gradually behind it, and the reading you do, the research you put into it, the pictures you look at, all the massive baggage that goes into writing a novel, you can unwind it in various different directions. You can change your mind and come back and rethink things. It's a kind of more like a journey, whereas the short story is a little thing kind of standing perilously on the edge of something. And my own feeling, I mean, there's probably short story writers in this audience who would disagree with me, but my own feeling is that one has to have more or less the totality of the thing in one's head. That's not to say that you aren't alert to the possibility of that totality being wrong, and therefore kind of in a story as long as the Tolstoy story, for instance, you know, are the things that need changing as one goes along. But that's what's difficult about it. And again, I say this to my students, you've got to have the whole damn thing in your head, otherwise it's not going to cohere.
It was very interesting, wasn't it? Just recently, Hilary Mantel's rather, how can we put this, sensation-causing short story, The Assassination of Margaret Thatcher. One of the things that I found so interesting about that was that she said she'd started writing it years and years ago and couldn't kind of see where it was going and couldn't, I think she put it, couldn't solve the technical hurdle that she found in it, and finished it, 20 years later. That's very at odds with the idea that someone like me might have of a short story coming in a burst.
I think that is very interesting, but I can completely understand that. The story that was headed up my last collection, which was called The Darkness of Wallace Simpson, for some reason I was put on to a lot of historical reading about the life of Wallace Simpson. And it is, we all know it, but it is a rather gripping story. And all these sort of unknowns about Wallace's past and what sexual techniques she'd learned in China and what was her hold over the Duke of Windsor, and there are all sorts of unknowns about Wallace, despite all that's been written about her. And I got more and more sucked in, and I've got that many books about Wallace Simpson on my shelf. But I had to put it away. I thought, I am very intrigued in this story, but it's history, and there's nothing I can do with it. And then it just came to me like 2 years later. I thought, actually, we need to turn this in the way that memory works, and I am very interested in the way our memories work, and I turned it to the idea that at the end of her life, we know that she died a rather lonely death in Paris, and that at the end of her life, she can remember everything, or quite well, about her childhood and about her first marriage, and a little bit about Ernest Simpson, and absolutely nothing about the Duke of Windsor. So the historical, what history has marked her downfall is the thing she's forgotten. And I think lives sometimes go like that. They just do. You're not remembered in the way that, well, if you're remembered at all, but you're not remembered in the way that you think you might be remembered. And then I thought, actually, it's quite funny, because there's this guardian that she had in Paris sort of trying to force her to remember by showing her pictures and objects and so on. And her refusal until right at the end of the story, when she suddenly finds this word, darling, and she remembers that this is what he called her. He called her darling.
This just sort of chimes with a conversation I was having recently with Ali Smith for an interview that, who is much as you are, celebrated almost equally for short stories and novel writing. And she was talking about the sort of differences. And one of the things that she said was that the novel is always tied to time. It starts and it has to go round like a clock, even if you're Virginia Woolf and that's your sort of primary ambition is to kind of defeat that. But a short story is always that bang of something happening and always has mortality in it. And just that kind of sparked me to think of that. You were talking about Wallace. I wonder if it does. I wonder if there's something, the minute it started, it's got to finish. Is there always a sort of the shadow of something dying behind it, do you think?
I'd need to think about that for longer. Is there always? I don't think always. I don't think always. I think there are stories in this collection where there isn't there might be a shadow of grief or a shadow of loss. I think this is the thing I was going to say earlier, which I forgot, which is the other thing that unites this collection of stories. But I only see that now, and I couldn't really see it across the years that I've been writing them, is this idea of loss. And it might be the loss of a person, or it might be the loss of money or status or territory or home, or just the loss of an precious object. But loss is We find it very difficult to recover from loss. I mean, I know that recent surveys have said that, even among children, that a loss of a loved grandparent or a loss of a pet is an absolute prime cause for depression, and then all the things that carries in its wake. So I am very interested in that, as well as this sort of firing moment where two things collide and change forever.
Let's just turn for a minute to your maddening career. I'm kind of assuming it's not maddening to you. You were not maddened by these changes of form and genre and subject matter and time schemes. It's what you wanted to do, or at least what you needed to do.
I think so. Oh no, I don't mean I think so. I know that's right. I think have always been uncompromising in what I chose to do, and the things that I have lighted upon have seemed to me the only thing that I could do at that time. So if I'd had the kind of relationship with a publisher, which I know some authors have, and of which in a way I'm quite envious, where you were, I sometimes wish I was P.D. James, who could just write another Inspector Thing story, and you've got an ongoing character, and you just have to think up, what happens next. But it's never been like that with me. I've always never been able to start a novel until I felt that actually the thing that I was writing was absolutely sort of crucial to my existence and my future and my understanding of where my own life was. Not that I am actually in the work very much at all. But again, this is I'm exploring it a bit in these stories, but much more in the novels is our quest for meaning. And I think this is something that we're particularly kind of afflicted by once we've passed the age of 60, that particularly if we have no religion, that we're questing after what are the things or people or hopes or dreams, or what are the things in life which give meaning to life. What is it that gets us up in the morning? What if we're actually resigned to there being nothing after death? What are the things that manage to keep us going, and why? This question of why. And I think that certainly in recent years, one of the characters in Trespass, and certainly Merivale in his older age, is deeply aware of his own potential fall into meaninglessness, which, yes, takes us back to the Jester story. Here is a man whose life has been very, very, very solitary, and geographically and emotionally and in every way isolated. And he keeps thinking about, what gives my life substance? Why am I alive? He doesn't have any religion. He has a wife, but he doesn't love her very much. He doesn't have any children. He thinks, why am I alive? And something is going to come. He keeps saying, something is going to come that is going to give my life meaning. And it does come. But of course there are lives where nothing comes. So I think our tussle with meaning, and therefore our whole tussle with ourselves and what we're doing, I would sort of stick my neck out and say it's probably the only subject, isn't it? I mean, once you're past the age of 29.
Do you think that would be an explanation, for example, of, there you were, you'd written Restoration, an enormously sort of elaborately plotted, peopled, described historical novel. And then I think your next novel after that was Sacred Country, which could hardly be more different. And I sort of have a little tiny bit of sympathy for your publishers, who must have thought, is this perhaps a different writer submitting under Rose's name? I mean, they were so different, but they do have that same thing, that quest for kind of, where am I in the world?
They do.
And then to sort of go forward to something like The Road Home, and again, completely different.
Yes. Somebody said when I wrote Sacred Country, which is a much quieter book, a more serious book, really. Well, I don't know about serious. It's certainly a quieter book. And somebody said, actually, I think what you've done is you've gone into the literary sauna and shed a lot of all of the excesses of Restoration, and now you've written this lean book. But perhaps just worth saying something about that book, because it's about a little girl who believes she's in the wrong gender, that she's really a boy who's going to grow into a man. And I wrote this in 1993, or rather it was published in 1993. And I think the reception that it got was one of true bafflement. People said to me, but they also said in reviews, why is she writing about this? It's such a marginal subject. And now I think if that novel were to come out now, it wouldn't be seen as marginal at all. I think it would be completely part of the conversation that's going on about gender and sexuality and who we are.
It's interesting. I remember reading that book and having it pressed on me by somebody who just said, "This is an absolutely."
And you thought, I don't want to read about it.
No, if you haven't read it, it is a wonderful book, and I just wonder if people still get in touch with you about it along that, given what you've said, that it is a kind of almost of increasing relevance in a way.
I don't think people read it anymore, although there is now a plan to turn it into a film, which I think is going to be very, very hard, because one of the hard things to do in film is the passage of years, and it takes place over 20 years. At the time, yes, I did get quite a lot of letters, but it was very interesting, the research that I needed to do that, which was on-the-ground research. It was talking to mainly male to female transsexuals who were very flamboyant about the journey that they'd been on, or mainly, one or two who weren't, but they were mainly flamboyant and giving about the journey that they'd been on. And I, through the Gender Dysphoria Trust, where I found somebody who helped me a lot, I managed to track down one female-to-male transsexual. And I wrote to him, and said, I don't want to steal your story. This is, I've got the outlines of my own story, but I want this to feel real to everybody involved, but for the audience as well. Can I come talk to you? And he wrote back and says, yes. And then as the day got nearer for going and doing this interview, there were no emails in those days, but I had a note or a message saying, no, don't come. And this happened 5, 6 times. And I thought, I can understand the psychology of this. He thinks that he wants to talk about this. And then as the day gets nearer, he realizes that it's too frightening. It's going to make him feel too vulnerable. Mm-hmm. So I was stuck then. So I did rely a lot on sort of medical research then, which is, of course, never the same as talking to somebody.
Just to ask you, before we hear you reading about this business of writing novels, which you do at pretty reliable intervals, they come along, and the making of the short stories. How does that happen in between? Is it something that you might suddenly think, okay, I just need to give myself a space to write something different, or you actually actively take time off from writing a novel, or what happens?
Sometimes they just sort of come almost like dreams. Why did I start reading about Wallace Simpson? Why did I start reading about Tolstoy? I don't know. It's just something about those two, that what happened historically to those two people, which I thought, I'm really interested in that, something there. So sometimes they come like that. Or sometimes they come sort of because I'm like Rapunzel and I've been locked in a room and told to spin straw into gold, or, come out with a bit of gold in a very short time. Like, somebody gives me a commission for a story. It's not in this collection, actually, because I think it's not one of my strongest stories, but I had a commission from the Telegraph. They said, would you like to write us a Christmas story? And my first reaction was, oh, God, no, I can't do a Christmas story. And then I thought, actually, I can do any story. Lock me in a room and tell me you're going to cut my head off and I'll write you a story, So I thought, well, my head's going to be cut off by the Telegraph if I don't write this Christmas story. So I went into my room for a few days and I came out with the Christmas story. I think I could do it now. Again, there's a lot to say about this, but again, I used to say to my students, there are two sides to write. There are many sides to writing, but there are two main sides to writing, and one is the technical side, where if you've been doing it as long as I have, your technical side is quite acute. You know what you're doing, and sort of how to do it, like actors, have been, they know what they're doing, and that's not so hard. But the other side knows nothing. This is the dreaming, crazy, imaginative side of your mind, which is just like a sort of tree in the wind. And it's getting the technical side to latch onto that and make it into something. And it's the tree blowing in the wind that you're not sure of. You don't know when those trees are going to come your way. That's not a very good analogy, isn't it? Trees don't move. But
Shall we hear one of your stories now?
okay. I have to go this awful rigmarole of changing glasses. I used to boast about my eyesight, and then I was a judge on the Booker Prize, and I read 132 novels in 3 months, and my eyes went down the pan. Can't see anything now. Anyway, this is a very short story you'll be glad to hear. Not the title story. And again, I'll tell you tantalizingly that it has a tangential bearing on my own girlhood. And it's called Extra Geography, and it's set in a girls' boarding school. For 2 sublime years, we were the wingers. We could outrun the field. For those 2 years at Upton Hall School, all lacrosse matches depended upon us. "Pass to the wing," the captain would screech to the fumbled, tangling, slow coaches in midfield. "Pass to Minna. Pass to Flick." With the ball caught, cradled, we'd fly over the muddy grass, and the goal would tremble into sight, and the opponent's keeper would lumber out in her creaky shin pads, and our own forwards would prance up, neighing for the ball. But most times, our momentum just carried us on. We couldn't resist it, and one of us would score a goal, and then the whole team would come crowding round and clash their lacrosse sticks with ours in a victory salute. But in summer, there were no lacrosse games. We weren't heroines anymore, just ordinary girls. And this felt worrying, as though we might soon die. One hot day, as we sat in the Upton Hall Rose Garden, bored with everything, inattentively reading A Midsummer Night's Dream, Minna said to me, "Flick, I've got an idea. Let's fall in love with someone." My gaze moved up from Shakespeare's text and rested on Minna's features. She was growing into a beauty with grey eyes and chestnut hair and a chocolate mole on her thigh. We were both 14. I said, "Who have you got in mind?" Minna said, "No one. Let's make it random. Like Titania falls in love with that idiot disguised as a donkey. Let's choose the next person we see." The next person we saw was the geography teacher, Miss Delavine. Along she came, with her black hair gleaming in the sunshine, wearing a coral-coloured dress. "Hello, Miss Delavine," said Minna. "Hello, Minna." "Hello, Flick." She stopped and made polite conversation. She came from the South Island of New Zealand, and her pronunciation of certain vowel sounds was something new to us at Upton Hall School. When she went on her way, we appraised her. Her first name was Rosalind. Her skin was tanned, but her ankles looked chunky in navy canvas shoes. Minna said New Zealand women probably didn't know anything about fashion, but we couldn't let that matter to us. Love was meant to be blind. We had noticed, however, that Miss Delavine's eyes were violet blue and her teeth were white as cuttlefish. We decided her age was 39. We thought we'd start by being romantic and courtly. We stole a rose and walked to the bungalow Miss Delavine occupied beyond the lacrosse field and scattered the rose petals at the bungalow gate. When we came away, I felt sexy and strange, as though the rose petals had been virgin's blood. Then we decided we'd better get good at geography. So we stared at maps of New Zealand, trying to memorize place names and rivers and sites of mineral deposits. The place names that appealed to us most were Brightness Gully, and Desolation Creek. We agreed that our prime targets were to get ourselves invited to tea at the bungalow and to persuade Miss Delavine to let us call her Rosalind. Later in the term, our class went on an outing to the Science Museum in London. Minna and I held Miss Delavine's hand, one each, as we gazed at a diorama of a Maori village, and she said, "What the diorama doesn't show is the sadness of the people." I looked at Minna because I had no idea what comment to make, and I saw that Minna had no idea either. By now we knew a lot about New Zealand weather and cabbage trees and flightless birds, but nothing about the country's history. Miss Delavine went on. "Shall I tell you something not many people know? My grandmother was Maori. She deserted her tribe to marry a white man, a Pākehā. My grandfather, Josiah Delavine." Minna said, "Does that make you feel sad, Miss Delavine?" "No," she said, "I'm proud of my Maori blood. But the Maori haven't been treated well. They've lost far too much of their land." "We'd love to see a picture of your grandmother," I said. "Have you got one at the bungalow?" "Yes, I'll keep one by my bed." I didn't dare look at Minna. Pressing my hand against the hot glass of the diorama, I said, "You could invite us to tea, and we could do some extra geography, and you could show us the picture." In the coach going back to Upton Hall, Minna asked me, "Are you in love with her yet?" "I don't know," I said. "I liked holding her hand." "I like her smell," said Minna. I said, "Let's pretend we're in a Maori village alone with her, wearing skirts made of flax. Let's pretend we're plaiting feathers into her hair." So we put our heads close together and closed our eyes and imagined the sunlight depicted in the diorama falling on us and on Rosalind Delavine and on all the acres of land stolen from her family, rippling away to the horizon. But we were so tired from the long day, we both fell asleep. Near the end of term, we got our invitation to tea. Laid out on a teak table was a sponge cake and a plate of penguin biscuits. The tea was in a floral china pot. Miss Delavine had put on crimson lipstick. It was raining outside, and Miss Delavine had turned on the gas fire and lit a cosy little lamp. And I tried to imagine that there was nothing beyond the windows, not even the lacrosse pitch or the rain, but only the deep, soft darkness of the universe. We drank the tea and ate the food and passed the picture of Miss Delavine's grandmother from hand to hand. The grandmother wasn't dressed in a skirt made of flax, but in some starchy old dress with a white lace collar and button-up boots. And I felt disappointed, except that her face was beautiful, with heavy black hair wrenched into a bun. Looking from her to Miss Delavine and back again, you could see that some of her beauty had descended down the generations. After the second cup of tea, Minna said, "It's fine if we call you Rosalind, is it?" When Minna said this, Miss Delavine inclined her head as though she was listening for something, some animal noise out there beyond the windows of the bungalow. Then she said quietly, "What is it, you two? What is it you want?" Neither Minna nor I could move or say anything. We just sat there dumb like stupid lacrosse reserves on the pavilion bench. The fire burned blue. Then Rosalind Delavine reached out and began stroking Minna's chestnut hair. I saw Minna's head move slowly sideways, and I knew what was going to happen next. There was going to be a kiss. I stared at the kiss, mouth on mouth. When, after a long, silent moment, Minna's face was separate from Rosalind's again, it was smeared with the crimson lipstick, and her eyes looked drugged, as though by some weird sleep. I waited, very still, because I thought that now my turn for a kiss would come. But it didn't. Rosalind got up suddenly and began pacing about the tiny lamplit room. "Gracious," she said, "gracious, how wrong of me. I just don't know what happened there. You must go, Minna. Flick, off you go. Goodness me, if the head knew, really, I dread to think." We walked back to the dormitories through the rain. I gave Minna my handkerchief so she could wipe Rosalind Delavine's lipstick off her face. When she gave the hanky back, I said, "Minna, was it fantastic?" But she didn't answer. She strode on as though what had happened had nothing in the world to do with me. In the autumn term, there was a new geography teacher called Miss Smith. When I asked the head whether Miss Delavine was coming back, she said, "No, dear. She's gone back to her faraway land." The lacrosse games began, and we took our wingers' positions on the field. But something was wrong with Minna. She'd lost her speed. The midfielders from the opposing team came charging towards her and tackled her long before she got anywhere near the goal. And soon enough, she was dropped from the team. I thought she'd be upset about this, but Minna said she didn't care, that lacrosse was for kids and she wasn't a kid anymore. Hadn't I noticed? She showed me a photo of a boy called Jeremy she'd met in the summer holidays. She said, "That Rosalind thing was a laugh, but this is real." The winter began seeping in, and as the dark came down on the lacrosse pitch, I'd often stare over at Miss Delavine's bungalow. It was unoccupied now, and I noticed that one window pane was broken and that the paint was flaking off the door. In my mind, I named it Desolation Creek.
Thank you, Rose. That was so fabulous. And what kind of reveals itself even more when you hear it perhaps read aloud is just that essentially we just don't really know anything about Miss Delavine. She's not given any lines apart from that killer line, you know, where she says, "What is it you two, what is it you want?" And it's not her story. It ends and we never will know what has happened to her, which seems almost a sort of the essence of the kind of short form in a way.
Yes, and I think that is true to what happens in, or that the kind of the essence of this story is true to what can happen, or certainly could in the 1950s, in a single-sex school, that you do sort of every day you're undergoing a sort of dying of boredom to a certain extent, and so you do invent things. You invent not just things to do like putting on plays or whatever, but I think you invent kind of emotional involvements, which then, of course, don't really have a bearing on your life. They're just sort of, you can feel very strongly, and then they come and they go, and that's how it is. And you probably don't know much about that person, and yet you never forget them. You know, those girls, I imagine, will never forget what they did. And they haven't done anything terrible, but they've done something significant.
And not something that they could possibly know the effects of
Yeah.
as we know. Shall we open up to some questions from the
I'll
audience?
just put my
Could
glasses
we
back.
could we have the house lights up a little bit so I can just see where to point? We've got two roving mics, I think. So who would like to kick us off with a question for Rose? Is there someone wonderful? Someone right at the back. You might like to stand up. You have. Thank you.
Just speak into it.
Is that right? Can you hear me?
Perfect.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And thank you for reading that story so beautifully. I would love to know, when you have an idea, a germ of an idea, or a character you're imagining, interested in, what is the process of deciding whether this is a short story or whether it can grow into a novel?
Well, it's a very good question, and I always used to say, again, I don't want to keep quoting what I said as a teacher, but I did used to say to my students, don't imagine that if you've written a very good short story, that this has the legs, has the energy, has anything that can make that story turn into a novel. And what am I about to do? I'm about to turn a story that I wrote some years ago into a book. And I think occasionally, I mean, this answers your question in a sort of tangential way, which is that you think the story is limited to, and limits of, as I said before, are very, very important in the construction of a short story, and knowing where you're going with it is very, very important. And you think that it can just exist within those limits. And just very, very occasionally, you go back to that piece of work and you think, actually, there is a world in there. There is a world. And this is fine. It can be left just as a world. And as I said earlier, the reader can take whatever he or she wants from it. And ideally, this is what you take from a short story, a world. And you want to have the feeling, I think, as a reader of a short story, that you read something longer and more substantial than the thing that you have read. But just occasionally, this happens to the writer, and you go back to an idea, and in my case, whether this will work out, I can't possibly tell you. It may not. But I went back to this story, which is about male friendship, which is the thing I've written about before, platonic friendship, which I am very interested in. We write so much about romance and sex, and platonic friendship between, well, men and women, and men and men, and women and women. It's very interesting to me. And I feel that there is more, and a lot more. So I'm in the process of meandering, I think is the right word, towards a book.
You're not going to say which story or how you're going
well,
to...
Well, it's not in the collection. I deliberately taken out. It's from the past.
Oh, I see. Oh, it's not from another collection either.
No.
Intriguing.
Yeah.
It's certainly true that there are also these other characters who are not centre stage in stories, aren't there? I think, for example, there's a wonderfully sad and funny story in this book about an elderly couple who are kind of terrorised by their daughter, who's off stage pretty much the entire time, really. And I found myself thinking, gosh, I could read a whole book about her. She's a kind of terrific character. But you almost in stories sort of invent things, and have to leave them small, don't you? You
have to leave them small. And as I say, I think you probably added a lot of your own imagination, your own decisions about that character.
Let's have another question. Who would like to ask it? Yes, there's somebody right at the front. Sorry to... Don't run and fall. Thank you.
You said earlier on that you want people to take from a short story. I'm not sure whether you meant that as a novel, what they can from it, rather than from anything that what it meant to you as you wrote it. Is that just something that is more significant in terms of short stories and poetry writing than it is to the novel form? Does the novel tell the complete story, and they take from that the complete story? The short story, the poem, is very much for the person to analyse that and take it into themselves and find meaning in it from that.
It's a very good question. I think you hope that the readers are going to take and make a lot from both. But of course, what you're giving them with a novel, you're giving them a much bigger gift. You're giving them much longer time to spend in your world. You're furnishing a world in a much more complete way for them. That's not to say you don't leave a lot of space for their imagination to operate. I mean, I think the best writing elicits lots and lots of different responses from readers. So it's not that I think in the short story, It's such a good question. I'm not sure I've really got the perfect answer to it, but it's not like the stories are open-ended. I mean, some people do write short stories, like John Cheever, that are open-ended, and in a sense, you are left with this task of making up your own end, or deciding, what happened then, you know. But I think from the story I just read, that's, in a way, it's a closed end. And we know where those people are going to go. But it's a big subject, but, you know, all of this is a contract between the writer and the reader. And don't, you know, I say to us, don't forget the reader. Don't, you know, leave space for the reader. Don't tell them everything.
Where's our next question? Sorry, I'm peering right at the front again.
Rose, was it difficult to convince your publisher to publish a collection of stories?
No. They didn't pay me very much for it. But they knew it was coming for a long time. And that's, as Alex mentioned, that's been the pattern of my writing life. I seem to be able to manage to come up with a novel every 3 years or something like that. And then every 5 or 6 years, there are enough stories to make a collection. I was very, very selective with this collection. There are 3 or 4 that I just sort of went back and looked at, and I felt they weren't strong enough to be in this collection, and they'll probably just sort of fade away. But no, I mean, I understand that you know, I mean, festivals like this do much for the short story. I have to say, it's wonderful. But I do understand that there is a problem with sales. And I think the reason for that is that I would say this about my own reading habits, that I love settling down with a long novel. It's like suddenly making a wonderful new friend who you can go to bed with. So I think readers do love novels when they really work. And the short story, it's different. It's different. It's a little bite. You could maybe read one at the hairdresser's or something, or on a train. I think they have their own little focus, but it's different.
Do you think it's changing though in any sense? I mean, you're right. Short story collections, of course, have always been said to be rather difficult to sell by publishers. Then you come to a festival like this. The event is sold out and has been for a long time. But do you think it's also changing because of the ways that we're reading? Do you think something that is suited to reading in a kind of shorter bite is perhaps going to kind of resurge in popularity?
Somebody said that very thing to me the other day. It was a male reader, and he said, actually, no, I really like short stories because I can just go and read one, and I'm not kind of constrained to remember what's going on. He obviously had difficulty remembering where he was in a novel. And I can just read this story at a gulp, and that suits me very well. So maybe yes. And I think also certain things have happened to short story writers, like the Nobel Prize for Alice Munro, who's never written, don't think she's ever written a novel. Her stories are much longer. They're more kind of baggy than some. But so I think, I don't know, maybe this comes at quite a good time.
I wonder if I can just finish by asking you who some of your favourite short story writers are. I mean, one of the things that I love about the form is that when you start to think about who the greats of short story writing are, you go on for a long, long time. You start to think of Catherine Mansfield, then you think of someone completely different, like Somerset Maugham, for example. Yeah. You mentioned Alice Munro. I wonder if you've got anybody who really means a lot to you.
There are mainly American writers, and I'll tell you for why, which was that in the end of the 1980s, I went to teach creative writing at the University of Vanderbilt in Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville, Tennessee comes into my stories quite a bit. You can't go to Nashville and not write about it. And when I arrived on the first day, the dean said to me, good. These are your creative writers. And now your short story seminar is going to start on Monday. I said, oh, what short story seminar? He said, well, you're teaching a class on the great American short story. God. So I went to the excellent library and began pulling out books. And I have to say that whether the first weekend was hell, I had jet lag, I was, starting at Washington Irving and ending with John Cheever. It was very demanding, but I learned so much in that term. I think I just about managed to stay 1 week ahead of my students. I learned a heck of a lot about the short story forms. I would say that some of those American writers, I mean, there's some people you may not even have heard of, like Robert Penn Warren, who's a Southern writer. Eudora Welty is also a Southern writer. But also coming right up, to Bernard Malamud. And Hemingway actually wrote some wonderful stories. Scott Fitzgerald wrote some bizarre but wonderful stories. So, yes, I think that mainly I think that has continued in my mind. I think that Annie Proulx, in our own time, I actually would lay myself on the line and say that I think she's a better writer of short stories than Alice Munro. But that's just my preference for the kind of bitter and very achieved shortness that she puts into them. So, yes, I think that it's sort of, there is an agreed thing. It's the time of the short story.
This has been wonderful time spent talking to you. I'm sure you'll join me in thanking the audience for coming, and also the Small Wonder Festival for having us here. But thank you so much, Rose. You're going to be signing outside. Yes, you're going to tell us. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose, for a wonderful glimpse into the short story form and a fantastic exclusive first reading from your new collection, a wonderful story, and for revealing yet another one of your talents, the fact that you can do a marvellous New Zealand accent. Thank you. And I'd also like to thank you, Alex. You won't be surprised to know that Alex is a very highly regarded reviewer, a literary reviewer, broadcaster and editor, so thank you for drawing Rose out. I'd also like, before we take Rose and Alex off the stage, also very much like to thank and express our appreciation to the sponsors of this afternoon's session, Rathfinny. I believe that the owner of Rathfinny, Mark Driver, might be somewhere in the audience. It seemed a very compatible sponsorship because Rathfinny is just establishing a wonderful state-of-the-art vineyard in Sussex, and I think that connects with Rose's French, the part of your French background. They're going to be producing wonderful sparkling wines. So thanks for a very sparkling session.
Pleasure. Thank you for having us.
Would you mind remaining seated while I take Rose and Alex off the stage and Rose to the bookstall?